My next guest is a former ambassador to NATO who was also Donald Trump's special representative for Ukraine negotiations. The former president recently sent shockwaves through Western capitals when he said he would encourage Russia to do, quote, whatever the hell they want to any NATO country that fails to meet its membership contributions. And last week, President Putin repeated his threat of nuclear armageddon if NATO forces set foot in Ukraine. Well, to take the temperature of the diplomatic situation, I'm joined from Washington, D.C. by Kurt Volker. Ambassador, thank you for the time.
It's my pleasure, Riz. Great to be with you.
Thank you. So we've just marked the second anniversary of Russia's invasion into Ukraine in February 2022. The largest invasion and attack on Europe since World War II, and one that's really had an impact on alliances across the world. I'm wondering, are you surprised, or how surprised you are that it's reached this 2-year mark with no clear sign of resolution?
I think that we, in some ways, have to bear some of the responsibility for letting it get on this long. I think the West has provided remarkable support to Ukraine, military, economic, and so forth, but we've done it slowly. We have been reluctant to give them the weapons they needed when they needed them. And as a result, the Russians have been able to dig in and build very strong defensive lines. And now we see a war that is kind of stuck in place for the moment. So very unfortunate. But the good news in this is that Ukraine clearly survives as a sovereign, independent European democracy. It has a stronger sense of national identity and unity than it ever had before. And it's clearly going to be coming into the European Union and NATO. So exactly what Putin was trying to avoid, to claim that Ukraine is really actually Russian somehow, he has created the opposite effect.
Well, I'll get on to that in a second, but you were President Donald Trump's special representative to Ukraine, a voluntary position, I should point out, until 2019 when you resigned. So you know the country well and you know what's been happening there, but how surprised were you when you heard that Vladimir Putin had escalated it in February 2022?
Yeah, not at all, to be honest. We are not only marking 2 years of Russia's full-scale invasion, we're marking 10 years of Russian war on Ukraine. I remember in 2014, February 20th, we saw these little green men pop up in Crimea. They eventually seized Crimea. They started fighting, attacking in eastern Ukraine. Eventually, there was a ceasefire and the Minsk agreements put in place to try to regulate that. It didn't work. I spent years talking with the Russians about that, and I'm not at all surprised that they attacked again.
So how do you respond to those who support Vladimir Putin's view that the affiliation that Ukraine has had for NATO and for the EU membership is a threat to his country, that it pushes onto his borders and is a threat to his national security, effectively?
Yeah, well, it's simply not backed up by the facts. First off, Ukraine was not making fast progress toward NATO membership in 2014 when he attacked, nor had there been any progress between 2014 and 2022 when he attacked again. And, Russia has had borders with NATO, the United States, Canada, Norway, Baltic states for years and years, and there's no threat to Russia from that, and Russia knows that. So the pretext that somehow Ukrainian NATO membership is a threat to Russia is just that. It's a pretext for Putin launching his war because he rejects the idea of Ukrainian statehood.
Well, sir, but President Putin does say that, what he's done is simply a reflection of what the West does when it comes to protecting its own territorial integrity. And I wonder if there's anything that could be said to assuage his concerns that he wouldn't be threatened.
Well, again, it's a lie because no one is attacking Russia. There's no threat to Russia's territorial integrity. No one is seizing Russian territory. It is only Putin that is invading other countries, Ukraine, but also prior to that Georgia and also occupied part of Moldova. And it is Russia that is killing Russians. The large number of casualties in Ukraine are largely Russian-speaking people. And the soldiers that Putin has killed now, his own soldiers, 300 to 400,000 have been killed. So he says one thing, but the reality is far from that.
We just heard recently that Moldova's breakaway separatists and rebels in Transnistria are now asking for Vladimir Putin's support. And I wonder to what degree that marks a larger problem, perhaps, with the Kremlin at its center.
Well, it's not new. They had previously had a referendum asking to be joined up with Russia. It is a separatist region, but they are increasingly connected to the rest of Moldova itself for economic benefits, for trade, for transit of goods. Labeling of goods from there is labeled Republic of Moldova. Their source of income is purchases of electricity from Transnistria by the rest of Moldova. So I don't think this is real. I think it is posturing by the FSB and GRU officers that run the separatist militia there, but I don't think it reflects what the people in Transnistria even really want.
Considering your role as US ambassador to NATO too, I wonder if you have any idea of what's going on in the corridors of power there in terms of seeing how things are developing now, though.
Yes, and I've had some very recent conversations about that with several different allies. I would say that NATO has gotten a bit more serious about its basic mission of collective defense. More and more countries are increasing defense spending up to the level of 2% of GDP or more, which is what they promised in 2014 but hadn't delivered. Back in 2017, only 3 NATO allies were spending 2% or more of GDP on defense. Now it's 18 of them. A country like Poland is spending 4% of GDP on defense. And Germany, the largest economy in Europe, is spending 2% now. So this is a lot more money going into defense for the protection of NATO itself. And there is substantial support for Ukraine coming from Europe and the United States. So there's much more unity of purpose and a lot more resources coming into this, all because of Vladimir Putin's invasion.
It's true, actually, Ambassador. It's ironic that, as you said earlier, it's had the opposite effect, if that's what his concern was. But President Emmanuel Macron of France recently said he was considering putting troops into Ukraine. And Vladimir Putin just responded by saying, well, that would risk nuclear war. How real do you think that threat is?
Right. Well, first off, I think what Macron said was that nothing is off the table, that troops should not be off the table because we cannot allow Russia to defeat Ukraine. That's a slightly different nuance to his point. Let's also remember that Russia has troops in Ukraine, and it's the only country that has troops in Ukraine other than Ukrainians themselves. No Western countries are there. As far as nuclear weapons goes, if Russia were actually attacked, and if people were trying to topple the Russian government or seize Russian territory, then I think use of nuclear weapons by Russia could be realistic. It's part of their doctrine to defend themselves. But the reality here is that no one is attacking or threatening Russia. It is Russia that is trying to seize its neighbor's territory. And there, in that instance, it's not part of their doctrine to actually use nuclear weapons. Using them would not advance their objectives of seizing Ukrainian territory, and it would also invite a more direct response against Russian forces than we have seen to date. So I'm skeptical that they would actually go through with the use of nuclear weapons, even though they like to make those threats.
Considering how well you know the Ukrainian people, especially having had that role as US Special Representative to the country, I wonder, when you look at the second anniversary having come up, what you see as a feasible outcome at this stage?
Ukraine's survival as a sovereign, independent European democracy is without question. It is firmly rooted. There's a strong sense of national identity, strong sense of resilience, strong determination to fight. We don't know how the fighting will go over the course of the next year or two. It is a very tough struggle with Russia, but people are giving Ukraine more and more assistance. We're going to see F-16s get online in Ukraine later this year. The Swedes are talking about providing Gripen aircraft. European states are ramping up defense industrial production, including for artillery shells. The Ukrainians themselves have made tremendous progress with drones, both aerial and naval drones. So Ukraine is gradually getting a stronger and stronger position, and they are gradually taking out Russia's ability to supply Russia's own forces in the field. So I think this is going to be very hard and difficult, but I think you will see Ukraine gradually gain a stronger position than Russia.
Although, Ambassador, it seems at the moment Ukraine's perhaps a little panicked about having a lack of ammunition, having the lack of support that they initially thought they had from Western allies.
Yes, and that is particularly driven by the slow process in the U.S. Congress for approving the next tranche of military assistance for Ukraine. The proposal from the administration is $61 billion 16 of that in economic and humanitarian support, 45 billion in military support. It's already been approved by the Senate by 70 votes to 30. The House of Representatives has not acted yet, not because of Ukraine, but because of differences over what to do about America's southern border with Mexico, where we have a massive illegal immigration problem. But I'm very confident, and having spoken with several congressmen and senators in the past few weeks, I'm very confident that this will get approved and the aid will begin to flow again to Ukraine. You're right that people in Ukraine are concerned. There's a high level of anxiety, but I do believe this will get done and that it will continue to strengthen Ukraine.
Sir, I know it was a voluntary position you had under Donald Trump, but what made you sort of quit the job in September 2019 when you did, after 2 years?
Well, as you'll remember, in September 2019, an impeachment inquiry was launched by the Democrats in the House of Representatives against President Trump. And having been at the focal point of U.S. policy on Ukraine, where that was the subject of investigation, or Trump's statements and conduct and phone call was all about his phone call with President Zelensky of Ukraine, it wasn't going to be possible to continue in the same role anymore. I had to put down the duties as special representatives, focus on preparing and taking part in the impeachment hearing, where I was the first witness to testify, and then to move on from there. But I've stayed very closely in touch with Ukraine over the subsequent 5 years.
And I've heard you say, Ambassador, that whether it's a Biden presidency or Trump presidency that comes up next after this election, that it's still a win for President Putin. Why is that?
Well, I'm not sure I said it's a win for President Putin, but he feels comfortable either way. He feels that Donald Trump is someone that he worked with before. There are suspicions that he would be willing to cut a deal, that Trump would be willing to cut a deal with Russia about Ukraine. So I think he is hoping for that. At the same time, I think he sees that the Biden administration has been very cautious, hesitant, afraid of escalation. And so he feels that he has done well in managing the American administration and solidifying his position on the battlefield over the past 2 years. So I think he feels like he has his cards or his ducks in a row either way, no matter who's elected.
Now, President Zelensky in Ukraine has tried to emphasize a number of times how the issue of Ukraine and what's happening there potentially poses a much bigger problem for the world order. To what degree do you feel that that's perhaps overstated, or do you actually share his level of concern?
No, I very much share that concern, because I think that we see countries such as Iran, North Korea, China, Russia, all authoritarian states, and all seeing how the West is reacting to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And if Russia is able to get away with it, to seize territory, to kill so many thousands of people, but ultimately the West allows this to happen, does not support Ukraine, they all think that they have similar opportunities in their own regions. China vis-a-vis Taiwan, Iran, as we already see a war in the Middle East right now, but potentially interested in even more than that. North Korea facing South Korea, and so forth. So it's very important that the West pull together, that we support Ukraine, and the Russian forces are actually defeated, and Russia is shown to have weakened itself by launching this aggression. That would be the best deterrent to any of these other states launching further aggression on their own.
But again, Ambassador, since it seems to be in limbo at the moment, realistically, how long could this conflict go on?
It's very hard to say. It's very hard to put an end date on anything. I think 2024 is going to look a lot like the second half of 2023. Not much movement on the ground. But as I said, I think you're going to see Ukraine gradually rebuilding some capacity, getting a bit stronger. As far as what goes on after that, I think some people are anticipating an upsurge in fighting again in 25 as people try to establish their positions on the ground. I hope that by then the U.S. assistance has arrived, the aircraft, the F-16s and so forth have arrived, defense industrial production is online, so we can be sending a clear message to Putin that he can't out-escalate what NATO and Ukraine are able to do together.
Ambassador, of course, Russian elections are literally around the corner. Any surprises you expect there?
No surprise in terms of who the approved candidate is and the fact that he will claim victory in a so-called election. I'd say the only thing that has been a bit surprising is the degree to which he seems nervous about showing the Russian people that he is truly in a position of strength. The death or the killing in prison of Alexander Navalny, the refusal to release his body in a timely fashion because he was concerned about protests, the tremendous loss of life that he inflicted on Russian soldiers as he wanted to take the town of Avdiivka in Ukraine in order to show a battlefield success. These are all signs of weakness.
And there's a lot of reporting, of course, about how locked down the media is in Russia. But to what degree are you surprised that hasn't been more of a voice against what's going on in Ukraine from Russia itself?
Well, as you say, the media is completely under government control, Kremlin control. In addition to that, you see how he poisons and kills his opponents, so people are very cautious about speaking up. I think that what you can see is that the willingness of people to protest or to show up peacefully in protest about Navalny's death, despite then immediate and violent arrests of those people, that's an indicator already that there is some dissatisfaction. And last summer, when Prigozhin had his rebellion, there was no one standing up to defend Putin and defend the Kremlin. People were very quietly sitting it out, waiting to see what happened. So I think those are all indicators that under the surface, society is not as committed to this as Putin wants to portray.
Ambassador Kurt Volker, thank you very much for your time, sir. I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you, Riz.